Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Cuevas. Thank you. I greet you this afternoon with much respect and only half of my hearing. I have that, whatever, like, seems like everybody in San Antonio has this gunky, nefarious contagion, this intransigent contagion. So I'm not hearing well out of my left side. But it is a great honor to be with you. I am honored particularly to be in the roll call of Dr. Cuevas' seminar, along with my sisters Irene and Norma, on their texts. And also kind of timely to have an occasion to talk about my old stuff, one of the things I might impart to you from the very beginning now, because it's a very timely moment to capture you and intervene with this injunction: keep everything. Keep everything you do. No matter what a piece of crap it is, keep it. I basically started writing when I was about 14, and had the great serendipity in my life to meet the poet Naomi Shihab Nye. I don't know if y'all have encountered the San Antonio poet Naomi Nye, but we met when she came to Churchill High School, where I went to school as a poet in the schools. And she already had the audacity to think of herself as a poet, a Palestinian-American poet from San Antonio, by way of St. Louis and sometime in Jerusalem. But she urged all of us young wannabe scribes, to audaciously imagine ourselves into the literary epic of humanity. And that was in part an American literary epic. It was a time when we were reading a lot of beat literature: Jack Kerouac, William Burroughs, Diane Waldman. These were some of the voices that really first gave me this incredible impetus to take on the project of being a poet. But also the greater American literary tradition, for me particularly in those years: Herman Melville, William Blake. They proved to be kind of instrumental in kind of shaping my voice. So it's I think, interesting, important, perhaps not entirely evident, that to become a Tejano writer, means almost inevitably that we enter through the lens of the American literary history, American literary culture. So this Tejano literature wasn't something I was taught in high school, or in college, or in graduate school. It was something that had to be sought out, had to be, in part, invented. And we'll talk about that in a second. But the formation of young writers in the 70s was, to come up with your connection to the American literary story, or the British literary history. And I ended up spending a great deal of the succeeding 10 years of my life doing that, reading myself into that history, finding echoes of our South Texas world in the mystical geographies of Moby Dick, or the epic visionary imagination of William Blake. So I was always looking for resonance. I was always looking for points of contact. And not really yet knowing that the target was to write about our world here in San Antonio. That hadn't really yet fully registered, that my project would be to bring a story forward that I simply hadn't read, that hadn't been written yet. It's worth pausing a moment and just to kind of consider this term Tejano, which, like everything else associated with Chicano identity, Latina identity, is shrouded in mystery. Its origins are shrouded in mystery. We really don't know much about this term. The great Tejano historian, Frank de la Teja, who teaches at Texas State, about 2 years ago, gave a really good talk where he has done a kind of archaeological, genealogical dig for where this term first started getting used. You know, and he finds some evidence of it intermittently in early 20th century, late 19th century. But it's scant, and nobody defines it. Nobody, places it in this kind of literary cultural pantheon. You know, there had been these other strange words tossed about, Texian or Texican, that were associated with the independence movement. But it's worth noting that Tejano identity, Tejano history, is something that is protean, and it's in formation now. It's emerging now. We are in effect going to be the generation that has a chance to define it. And in fact, the new Whitty Museum, which will open in a month or two, is going to have a large Tejano exhibit that Andres Tijerina is going to oversee the development of. Another historian of Tejano culture, particularly South Texas Tejano ranching culture. So part of what the challenge was for me as a writer was to find my way back to these stories, because after a long detour in the academic world, studying English and British literature and literary theory and philosophy and critical theory, I was kind of in an outer orbit. I was sort of out in the Planet 9 orbit as far as relating to Texas roots. When I left graduate school, thinking that I was going to make films, I came back to San Antonio and started writing for the newspaper here. I started writing about, I was given a gig to write arts and culture features for the Express News around the time like 82, 83. And this was a period when Chicano art particularly was catalyzed, and there were lots of wars between artists, between the art centers and the city, between the city and cultural activist centers. So there was a lot to write about. And it was also evident that this story was about people trying to find their way, people trying to define themselves in a new way. And that began to add to my story. But I was still fraught in many ways with this academic language. So, I'd really been on a path to being a professor of sorts, sort of what I have somewhat become a little bit recently, but it was, on a path to becoming a PhD in English and teaching important things like that. And I got detoured by journalistic writing, but ultimately found my way to making television shows. So I ended up meeting some folks from CBS News when I was working on a documentary project. I wanted to make a film about Chicana spirituality here in San Antonio, and there was a group in Houston called the Southwest Alternative Media Project. They gave me a little bit of money. I was going to make this film based on snapshot albums, and particularly the snapshot albums of my tia Bibi, who was a kind of a tireless brownie snapshot photographer. Y'all will not know what a brownie camera was, but it was a little brown camera that you looked through the lens down at and you saw forward and you would like click it, and she just was constantly taking photographs. So she had hundreds of photo albums, and they were like anthropological documents of our family's life, because she took pictures, everything from fiestas and baptisms, funerals, menudo parties, new stoves, new refrigerators, new cars, everything you could possibly imagine was in these albums. So I thought I could tell a story about, the spiritual nature of our family through her snapshot albums. So I started this project, and I quickly ran out of money, and at that point was introduced to this executive producer from CBS, and And she wanted to make a film about Chicano spirituality, but she was not too intrigued by the idea of these snapshot albums. You know, she thought maybe something that dealt with how Chicanos celebrate Easter, something more conventional in that line. So we decided to collaborate, and she said, I'll send down a director, since I'd never made a film. You write it, and we'll be off to the races with this project. So so I set to writing this script. And it was a script that was drawn from some elements of our history here in San Antonio. It was drawn from family history. There were some archival materials in it, so some excerpts from classical literature, by then already coming into my kind of wavelength in the search for Tejano genealogy. In this case, specifically excerpts from Bernal Díaz de Castillo's account of the conquest of Mexico. So these excerpts were in there, this commentary, and I'm waiting for the director to arrive and expecting this very serious CBS News director, and instead this guy arrives who's kind of anarchist experimental filmmaker from Hungary, who had been trained in the most radical film institute in the Soviet world, the Bela Balázs Institute for Film Studies in Budapest, who read my script. He says, this is fabulous, this is fantastic. I tell you, it's so good, I'm going to do this. And he rips it up. He rips it up in like 100 pieces. And he says, and then takes the fragments and he begins to paste them into a very large black book. And so they're like these series of pages of collages of scraps of my script. He says, now we have a script. Now we can start. And in fact, it was the script. I mean, it was as if I was being kind of reminded of the writing techniques of some of the people I had first started reading. William Burroughs, in fact, used a very similar technique, a cut-up technique. How do you randomize yourself? How do you put your own intellectual process, your own creative process under interrogation? How do you alienate it? One way to do it is by tearing it up and reconstituting it like a deck of cards. And so this crazy script, which is not in this archive because Imre stayed with that script, was a kind of orienting device that we used over a period of 2 weeks to go out into the streets of San Antonio and shoot. I'll show you a little bit of it in a minute. And it turned out to be an incredibly poetic and profound evocation of our world here. What he taught me in that moment, in that kind of interval, was this process that's proven to be really important in all of this material, which is, how do you bring forward the unintended? How do you capture the inadvertent? It's very easy to sit down as an author, and I have lots of friends who are of this order, who can sit down every day from 9 to 5 and hammer out a work of intention. It turns out for me, the path kind of introduced in part in this first collaboration was to find my way into how to bring forward the inadvertent and the unintended, and to seek there something about an active witness with the world, which in some respects can never be fully anticipated. And in fact, the more it's anticipated, the more I'm suspicious of it. So he helped me a lot in terms of returning me to a creative process. His name was Imre Lazar. And this film actually got an Emmy nomination, which got me a ticket to New York and a 23-year-long semi-exile in Manhattan, you know? So, but I was always connected to this world. I was always connected to the stories of San Antonio, my family, our histories, our stories coming out of Mexico, our stories in what was New Spain, in what was Nueva Extremadura, what was Nuevo León, what became Texas. And increasingly, I began to see these layers of history that had accumulated upon us. And that was increasingly of interest to me as a writer. But I was making lots of TV shows, so I was making maybe about 7 or 8 documentaries a year at CBS. And writing was kind of like had become a secret life, a nighttime life. And there wasn't a lot of Tejano stuff going on in New York City. It's not a big focus of interest in New York City, our stories down here. The Frontera world is really not much on the radar, the cultural radar of New York City. So I began thinking about a kind of book that would begin to evoke those stories. And it wasn't until CBS canceled my show that I turned out to have some time to write. So CBS's canceling of my documentary series, and the fact that at the time when that show was canceled, I did have some auditions with like 60 Minutes and a couple of other CBS News programs, but my hair was down to here, and I looked even freakier than I do now, so I would terrify them, and I'd been reporting on religion and culture in large part at CBS, and I was particularly interested in the resurgence of Islam. And at the time I made these pitches to them that we had to cover this emerging group called Al-Qaeda in Sudan. It was the last thing they were interested in. So we parted ways, and I got a fellowship to devote myself to a year of writing at Columbia, at Gannett Center for Media Studies. And so I had this in mind a book. It was called Immaterial Empires. Immaterial Empires. Journeys into the Chicano Soul. That was the first title. So some of this story is told in the Farthest Home book, in the second book. It was a year where I was able to devote the entire year, for the first time ever, to writing. And so I was returning to these themes. What was the connection to our old world here in South Texas? What was the nature of this world? How could we tell its story in a way that hadn't been told before, in terms of our origins and the epic of Mexico and the events ensuing from the conquest of Tenochtitlan and the Aztec world, and all of the meetings of people that had taken place here in San Antonio. So the idea for that book, as I tell in the Farthest Home, was considerably more theoretical in nature. It was kind of like a work of cultural literary theory. But I was starting to write stories about, this son of a bitch pony we had on our ranch that could toss you like directly into a stand of cactus. It would like aim and but immediately target you into the stand of cactus. And I realized that that was much more fun to read and write than my theoretical business. And I had some first encounters with literary editors and agents. And the feedback from them was clear that there was this other frequency working in my writing that I hadn't yet fully recognized. That the family stories that had been given to me on my father's family side, the Santos Garcia family, were this trove of lore. It was a family that had come across during the time of the Revolution, around 1914. There were memories of what it was to cross the border then, kind of wooden bridge, no guards, going back and forth. And in fact, we had continued to go back and forth. And I was spending lots of my summers growing up as a child and into my adolescence and early college years working on a ranch up in the mountains in the Sierra Madre. And I realized that was the story. You know, that was really the story I had to tell. You know, there had been a couple of really important voices up to that time in terms of thinking about, well, how do you shape a voice that tells these stories? You know, growing up, the only voice that I'd really encountered that had some flavor of it was not a Mexicano writer, it was J. Frank Dobie. So J. Frank Dobie's Tongues of the Monte and the Texans and the Vaqueros, the Brush Country, these books had all given me a hint of how to connect in a literary way to the landscapes I was familiar with. The landscapes off the Pleasanton Road south of San Antonio, or Petula, Texas, or Hondo, Texas, or Enchanted Rock. And when I was in maybe late high school or college, was the first appearance of an article in the journal American Scholar, which I'd started reading then. You know, I thought, if I'm going to be an American scholar, I should read this journal called American Scholar. It's like self-evident, be reading this journal. And an article appeared in an issue by Richard Rodriguez called All-American Scholarship Boy. And here was for the first time a Chicano writer, kind of wary, somewhat self-loathing Chicano writer, but a Chicano writer writing about being Mexican-American in the academy, knowledge building and feeling somewhat contradictory in all the experiences he was having there. And so it was a point of contact with another voice out there who was bringing another piece of the story into focus for me, that we could also write about our intellectual selves. You know, even though I disagreed with much of what he was writing about, I found eloquence in his voice. And serendipitously, the year that I spent in New York for the first time writing into this Immaterial Empires project was the year Gloria Anzaldua's Borderlands La Frontera came out. And this was a new thunderclap for me, just a reckoning with a much deeper engagement with our histories, you know, a much more audacious engagement with not just the lands of South Texas, but questions of our links to the indigenous world, and questions relating to the legacy of our history as subjects of a colonial empire. Because we had been all of that. And so, you know, she was tremendously influential for me. I never got a chance to meet her. But that book, alongside with the fraught legacy of a writer like Richard Rodriguez, really gave me sort of two exemplars. You know, my other exemplars in the stories in the first book, you know, were really uncles and aunts, great uncles and aunts. My tío Beto, my uncle Lico, my abuela, my madrina. These were the ones who had been the storytellers in our family. And you know, when I set out finally, when I had that first reckoning with Immaterial Empires and realized I didn't want to write a theoretical book. I didn't want to write a book of philosophy. I wanted to write, you know, a story tale of a family that would connect a family to this epic coming out of Mexico. And so that first book, the Santos Garcia book, Places Left Unfinished at the Time of Creation, was an attempt to reckon with San Antonio's deep history, its geological setting, its rivers and streams, and the ranch life that surrounded us here, the world that connected me to Mexico, which was the ranch life in Coahuila, and then the journeys I had to undertake. You know, so I had this memory from that first reading, particularly of Jack Kerouac and On the Road, that you had to get on the road. As a writer, you had to get out and put yourself into that kind of place of flux where things were going to happen, things were going to present themselves. You were going to trace specific journeys, specific auspicious paths. And we had already made a road trip from San Antonio to Mexico City, where I had, my first, what my friend David Carrasco calls Aztec moment. I had my Aztec moment. My friend David Carrasco tells it very eloquently about his initial Aztec moment when nobody told me about this gigantic pyramid city. Nobody told me about this huge museum full of the most exquisite and complex artifacts. It was just never told to me in Texas high schools, Texas public schools. So that was one journey, this umbilical cord between Mexico City, the place of the conquest, and San Antonio, which was in that epic story. And we're about to observe the 300th anniversary of that story next year, the 300th anniversary, which is very old in terms of American cities. But in terms of the Mexican epic story, it's already 200 years into the story. So we were one of the last developments in that story. And then the other journey was the journey from Veracruz, where Cortés landed, to Mexico City, the other journey. So these were the two umbilical journeys that I ended up making. By the time this happened, I'd gotten a book deal. I'd sort of written the first 3 chapters of Places Left Unfinished, and I got a deal, and that allowed me to leave the television world and to spend really the next 2 years in Mexico, traveling into the journeys of the history, but also into villages to look for the origins of the volador ritual and all the things that found their way into Places Left Unfinished. And but I'd never written a book, and so how do you write a book? How do you write a book? And that's what I can sort of illustrate here to some extent with this material. And again, thinking back to just the injunction to never throw anything away. So like this book here is essentially my first journal. So this journal, and this stuff is not in the archive because I still use all this stuff. The stuff that's in the archive is stuff that I've done and I'm revisiting now in reflection and trying to remember exactly how it was I did that and where I was when I did that. But these things I'm still using. So this is a journal really that I began my last year of high school. I can show you just in this overhead here. And there, just about anything that appears in this kind of material is meaningful to you. So you keep it, and you periodically revisit it, and it has something new to tell you. One of the things that I've found as it's accumulated, and there's a lot more, this is just stuff I grabbed on the way out of the house today, but one of the things you learn when you go back to this stuff, at least in my case, you have the impression that you have like this infinite panorama of ideas going, this kind of spinning plate galaxy of ideas. When you go back to visit, you see you have like 2 or 3 ideas that you keep doing, various riffs on. So like here is there's a little note here on the very front of this journal. Who is not the vassal of Moctezuma? And it's a chief from a particular indigenous community that it's an interaction he has with Cortés. And he's saying, we're all vassals of this emperor who's inland here. So I don't know when that gets fixed here. One of the things I love in this book is so this is it's up here. November 1975. This page is reserved for the date, the white, and several words explaining this. And then this is Borges' signature. So it's in Places Left Unfinished, the encounter with Borges, which is unfortunately is somewhat fateful. Involves Borges having to take a leak. I don't know if you've had a chance to read that yet. But when I was taken, the story unfolds. I have to go visit Borges after this event that causes him to take a leak, and that's the signature he gave me. You know, so all kinds. So here's a you know, woman I'd done an oral history with. You know, I began using a lot of photographs and stuff as a way of kind of compounding some of the material. You know, literary references, elements of it, you know, began to, you know, they would filter back into the writing later. Here's an entry, Alejo is alone on the Rancho Los Generales. This is the ranch that I've been working on in the summers, managing all of the chores of the place on his own. The man I met, Adolfo, never returned from Ciudad Juarez. He was the other vaquero when I was out at the ranch in June. I took he and his wife back to a bus there in Sabinas. He was, so, you know, just accumulating stuff. I mean, you see that all of these post-it notes, you know, these are from return visits, you know, so you are beginning to edit yourself. You know, every now and then only your shadow is your own, something gets thrown in there. So I began to develop a technique. So this came to England with me at some point, I guess. So there's a telegram in here, a very timely Valentine's Day greeting from a girlfriend. You know, so once these kinds of journals are done, they kind of lay fallow for a while, and then you go back and you begin to use them in a different way. You know, when I was at Oxford, I started. So here's well, this one's from April 7th, 1983. But I started. You know, I was spending so much time filtering media. I was spending so much time kind of churning through newspapers, magazines, scholarly works, you know, that I wanted to find a way to begin to kind of refract some of that into my journaling. And so things, you know, began to get a little more like collage driven. Or you know, readings. I was reading some Edward Said here at the Bodleian Library in Oxford. Some of this notebook finds its way into the Farthest Home. Late in Farthest Home, I talk about this particular interval where I was kind of beginning to work on different connections between Tejano identity and globalized spaces of identity and exploration. So Africa and Peru, you know, there might be a poem draft in there somewhere. You know, here's some notes from another scholar. I'm on Madelart, Multinational Corporations and the Control of Culture. Another little collage, more collages. You know, so this is 83. I didn't write Places Left Unfinished until 93 to 98. You know, so there's a lot of still feeling my way into this story. You know, And it's become part of my technique, in a sense, to spend a lot of time accumulating. So you've got the journaling, where you're talking about your everyday life, right? So journaling. That can go on regardless of whatever project is at hand, you know. And then there's some more considered note-taking, where you're beginning to gather material. So in this journal, some particular scholarly references that were coming into play in terms of my reading and research. Research to I knew not what yet. I mean, didn't have any particular direction as a project. I remember this photograph, it was just a photograph I found one day on the streets in Oxford. Watched the map markings on the ship as they carried us past the Great Banks of Newfoundland and then out to the high seas. And that finds its way into places. I don't know how many years later. There's a description in places. In those years, they would send all the Rhodes Scholars over on the Queen Elizabeth, the QE2. And so I made this ocean journey to England, and the ocean journey became, for me, a kind of time travel inversion of Cortés's journey. And so when we arrive in England, in places left unfinished, the way I tell the story of going from Southampton to Oxford kind of mimics Bernal Díaz de Castillo's account of approaching Tenochtitlan, and the savages were about to open their treasure troves to me. So literary references were beginning to kind of back channel into this drafting process. Once you're in that space where you're drafting, so you're in, you're now in a space of formation of something, and with places left unfinished, as I described a moment ago, I had to make this break with a certain kind of writing, a certain kind of academic writing, and I was beginning to work entirely in a more, what's come to be thought of as creative nonfiction. It was also memoiristic, but memoir in those days, 92, 91, 92, memoir was still kind of like this great old grandfather's shipping trunk of a literary genre. It was not, it was around the time that I was working on places that Angela's Ashes came out. Frank McCourt's Angela's Ashes, which, in a sense, completely redefined memoir. And then Mary Carr's Liars Club, not long after that. So the literary genre that I was beginning to feel my way into, along with, folks like Gloria Ansaldúa and Norma and Rodriguez, and, the kind of testimonio voice that's become critical to Chicano writing, Latino writing, was beginning to also, I think, germinate for a lot of us, that we had to somehow kind of go to a nonfiction voice. Others like Sandra Cisneros were working on a very memoiristic fiction voice, like in House on Mango Street. But everybody feeling their way in. So the technique that emerged for me was, to build on journaling, to have a strata of more research and analytical material, drawn from scholarly sources, drawn from historical sources, and you're sort of laying out the table of tools you're going to use. And then you start drafting. Then you start developing riffs and routines and sketches, you know. And for me, that has meant in part, you know, literally using sketches. So it's the way I'll begin. I will begin. And these are from the archive here. So this is an example of one from The Farthest Home. It's a technique that I basically developed making documentaries. So when I would make documentaries, I'd shoot all this stuff, and then I'd go back to the studio and I'd kind of make a log of all of the rushes, all of the various sequences, and then I'd begin to kind of, you know, configure them in storyboards and use those to develop the narrative. So this one, you know, deals with a couple of the elements in Farthest Home, the legacy of Escandon, the last conquistador, the conquistador born too late. You know, he did everything a conquistador had always done, but he got brought up on charges for it. You know, and the return to Spain, to Asturias, from my mom's village of Llanes, my mom's family's village, the porciones that had been a legacy of the Tejano land grants. One of the families in the story is my mother's links to the Guerra family, and that's a seal from the Guerra family. The far-flung constellation of missions, and the same place known as Revilla was also Revilla, the village that's now called Guerrero Viejo, the flooded city under Falcon Reservoir was once called Malcueco, and this was a pictograph that was associated with it. You know, so sketching becomes a way to organize those stories. I'll show you one more from Farthest Home. So here, having to do with the figure who comes to co-narrate The Farthest Home with me, the time-traveling ancestor from the future known as Cenote Siete, who you know, emerged in the story out of a long conversation I'd been having with him for most of my life, since I was a kid. So this has to do with some of his backstory. It involves electrocution and falling from the sky and awaking in a library of bees and not recognizing yourself in the mirror, and the day that Cenote Siete is discovered, kind of roaming what's become this kind of post-apocalyptic version of South Texas, and makes his way back to Revilla. So the sketching, and I'm not an artist, so these are very comic book echelon sketches. That's all you need to kind of just remind yourself of where the story's going, you know. And you've got in your pocket now, you're developing, you know, all of these riffs, drafts of material. You know, and the drafts of material are going to, you keep track of what's going on there. You know, which notebook has what. You know, which notebook has the Spain material, which notebook has here's one here, Jerusalem, Sevilla, Madrid, Bilbao, Llanes. So all of that is from Farthest Home, 2007. So that notebook has that material. And, you know, you are developing a system to catch this material, you know. This is actually from another project. This is from a Texas Monthly piece. So it's a border trip from 2010, August of 2010, between San Antonio, Raymondville, what is that? Sal del Rey, San Isidro, Rio Grande City, Zapata, San Ignacio, and Laredo. Correlated with these drafts of material. So what I try to teach when I instruct this kind of work is this process. It's almost like a filtering process. It's catchment, then filtering, then you're getting into editing, and then you get into configurations. When you're down to so what I learned from the first book was that ultimately you make your way to post-it notes. The post-it notes are the destination. Everything that emerges in this process of catchment and filtering ends up in the post-it note phase. And so everything that's on a post-it note corresponds to a piece of work. And the order of that note can be changed. You can move it around. That's why post-it notes are so great. And so this, in fact, is, and this was a period, I'd come back to San Antonio, and I sort of finished half of Farthest Home by then. This was around 2005. I'd moved back to San Antonio for the first time since 1984, and I was given an office in the downtown campus. Somebody, Ricardo and a couple of other friendly folks here gave me a space to work in. And so this is actually some stuff from there. So this is the first chapter. And this, in fact, is not the order in which things ultimately ended up working. But I had a kind of a proposal for the book that here you see this chapter, the Book of Swoons, which is in fact the first chapter, and it describes the chapter, what's going to happen in that chapter, backwards organ flute sound at the beginning of Strawberry Fields. I remember my first visit to Spain 2 decades before when I was nearly beaten to death, and the day I arrived in Barcelona, a swoon there too, the history and mysteries of my many swoons, fleeting glimpses of a world outside of time, part of becoming a writer. After years in New York, the old poet spirit leaves my body and I abandon the idea of writing a book about Spain and the discovery of the New World. A car crash brings changes. All of these are early versions of the configurations of the chapters. And so there's a long process there, where, especially in this professed commitment to inadvertency, you don't know how things are going to end. And so that proves to be very tricky in terms of making deadlines, especially when people have paid you to make a deadline, and you're like 2 years off from the deadline, and you're telling them, well, but the end hasn't happened yet. It hasn't manifested itself. But eventually you make your way, and the assembly is the last part. Catchment, filtering, catchment, writing and filtering, and then assembly. And that's the most ridiculous and ungovernable part. It's just like, how do you finish a work, and how do you know when it's done? And particularly with places left unfinished, it was a struggle over a period of 5 years, and I had sort of run out of my literary advance, which I thought would last, for 10 years. It ended up lasting like for 2, but it wasn't done yet, so I had to get a job again, and so I'm back in the groove where I've got a day job and coming home at night to write. And so I was in the very kind of final grips of the last chapter, and actually it was 98, and I took off from not coming down to San Antonio for Thanksgiving, so I could finish the manuscript, the Ford Foundation had given me some time to work on it, so they gave me a couple of 2 months or so to finish it. You know, and I was not taking any invitations to go to Thanksgiving dinners, and you know, the last person I wanted to see was my editor, so I was stuck in my apartment, and I figured, you know, I had to get out of there. So I get into the subway to go to some friend's house for a Thanksgiving dinner, and my editor, unfortunately, lived just one subway stop away. So I'm in the subway with the manuscript on my lap, and the door opens, and she walks in with her identical twin. Like, you know, not only her, but an identical twin. I thought I was having some like hallucination. So her name is Jane Van Meeren, and she was an amazing collaborator. She was the editor who bought the book, and you know, worked with me throughout. She'd never worked with a Latino writer. She was an editor at Viking Penguin, and she's now my agent, which is a great transition. The collaboration worked so well that she bought the second book, and when she bought the second book, then she moved to Random House, and so I lost touch with her for a little while I was working on Farthest Home, and then she surfaced recently and has become my agent. So, and one of the reasons why she's so brilliant as a collaborator, you'll see when I just show you this incredible work of art of the edited manuscript. So this is now, you know, through all that process that I've had to kind of invent, we get to a manuscript. And she was an amazing reader. So she never messed with anything in the book. She never wanted to take something out. She never wanted to, you know, fundamentally redefine some aspect of the narrative. She was just aiming to help me bring what I wanted to bring. And was an incredible interlocutor on things that particularly a work of Tejano imagination would have to confront. You know, so one of the things was use of Spanish in the manuscript, the use of Spanish in the language of the narrative in Places Left Unfinished, which was considerable, and the original plan was to put all the Spanish in italics. I don't remember whether this manuscript is still in this form, but the page looked like it had been like randomized with italics, just full of italics. So she said, well, why don't we take those words that have recognizable cognates for an English reader, and we'll bring them into Roman font. And the words that are less familiar looking, we'll leave those in italics. So she sort of proposed this idea kind of comparable to the cultural process that we had been involved with in South Texas for a long time of metabolizing Spanish into the English literary imagination. So she was incredibly scrupulous, and she was great yin to my yang. So she was very strict literary governess. You know, in some respects, she saved my literary ass in that she was super correct. And she said, you know, this story doesn't really have a clear plot line. And in some respects, nothing really happens in this book. But we're going to make sure there's an impression of a beginning, middle, and an end. And so her collaboration was of that order. And this is like the first time I've revisited it since then. But I've told her recently, you know, about it being in the archive here, and what a work of art it is. I mean, you have to see, actually, this side view to get a sense of it. See those little yellow strips? Those are all, and this was another kindred aspect of our collaboration, Post-it notes. She also turned out to be a Post-it note obsessive. But her Post-it note technique is is particularly impressive. You know, some things are, you know, kind of very self-evident. Things like, you know, chapter 1, do you want to use chapter and number? You know, so do you want to have numbers? So, you know, very concrete things. Just show you a couple of these pages. So here, so this is an interesting one. I said, you know, she didn't mess with stuff. The first thing I'll show you is something she cut. But in fact, it's something she cut that later in the process, ended up somewhere else. But here's one of the things that's so great about these notes. So here, let's see what this says. It says, John, I'm cutting this because it feels too abstract and doesn't really fit into the framework of the text as a whole. This gets to your point much more directly and fluently for the reader. Jane. Everyone begins John and ends Jane. So she has a kind of a formality about her that's still endearing, even though we've known each other, you know, like for 30 years now. You know, sometimes they could get pretty elaborate. I'll show you this one, and then we'll see if y'all have any thoughts or questions. So here's a page that has a lot more notes on it. Are we meant to think these are ghosts, or that because the migration from Mexico continues, the same faces keep appearing? Clarify. I mean, her name is Jane von Mirren. She's of Dutch extraction, but she got down into the Tejano gut bucket imaginary world that, you know, the book wanted to kind of bring forward, and she helped me kind of steward it into making. The final section of the chapter is very confusing. It seems to me you would have a stronger finality to this chapter if you're able to build on the new section about the New World, i.e. your suburban upbringing. The connection to ancient Mexican history is not at all clear as it stands. It seems to me that you need to move out of section on life in the suburbs to show how the past still pulls on you. So the opening with the ghosts is good, but after that you need to think, perhaps you need to focus on the family, and so on and so on. So this is incredibly rare now, to have this kind of edit. It's incredibly rare in the literary world. You know, and this was 98, 99, you know, and virtually doesn't happen anywhere for anybody. In fact, you know, with my second book, Jane had bought the book. She was very skeptical about the whole thing with the time-traveling ancestor from the future, and she was very skeptical about the idea of my sharing the book with him. But, you know, she believed in the course of the storytelling. When she left Penguin, Viking Penguin, she ended up giving the book to her boss, who had been a big supporter of mine, an editor named Paul Slovak, who's the poetry editor. He's an executive figure at Viking Penguin, but maintains the poetry series at Viking Penguin, and was much more of an enabler. You know, where Jane was my governess, my literary governess, Paul was, yes, people can time travel on DNA radio signals. Of course. You know, so it's one of the reasons there's a stark difference in those books. And in some respects, they have an argument with each other. But Paul, you know, either because he's too busy, or just not inclined, or just not of this order, to do something like this. This edited manuscript is a work of art, and you know, and I had, you know, two other edits that I used to do the final draft of the book. So one was an edit from Sandra Cisneros. She'd done an edit, which was also very helpful. I'm not sure it's in here. I think it is. And Naomi and I did an edit. I mean, they're basically the two, my two allies who see everything that I've done. So, so Sandra and Naomi, and then the tragedy of the calendar with this book was that I finished it, this draft that Jane edits here. I finished it on a Monday, and that Saturday my father was killed in a car wreck. And my mom was almost killed. And so during her recovery, she does an edit. And I think it's also in here. So those 3 edits, allowed me to kind of finalize this text. And with Farthest Home, it was a very different process. I was back on the road. I was, I had a process now established, a process that has now become sort of my métier, the way I do these things, and so it really, at the time at least, it didn't matter to me as much that I wasn't getting that deep feedback of the editor, and I felt like especially in terms of furthering a Tejano narrative, this was kind of going much farther into the story in a way that maybe Paul wasn't ready to fully join me with, even though he works with experimental writers like William Vollmann and Corgus and Boyle, and right now there's sort of a 3rd book in this series. So where the first book is Santos Garcia's, my father's stories, family stories. Second book, my mother's stories. The 3rd one is more of my own, more New York City, more out in the world, making the TV shows in about 20 different countries, adventures, misadventures, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, mainly rock and roll. And I'm early in the process. I don't have a feeling yet fully of what the shape of that story is. I know that we all sort of ended up in New York. I was the only Tejano in the group, but we were from all kinds of different backgrounds, Armenians and Jews and African Americans, and we were all kind of interested in theory and media. And we found our way, even though none of us had intended to be there, we sort of had a world there, and it's a story about what happens to that community and our various life paths. Right now, the title is, it's a kind of a working title, but it's called The Closest Thing to Famous, which comes from an article that had been written about an anthology of poems that Naomi had done that I was in, and the writer said the closest thing to famous is this guy, So I thought that was a good description of my life in New York City. So I think I'll end there. See if y'all have any thoughts or questions or any interventions or ruminations. Don't be shy. Yes?
So I just feel like that's like a super interesting way to put everything together. I haven't come across, anything like that. Mostly people just journal, but the whole, the storyboards and everything, I just thought that was super interesting. So thank you for sharing that with us.
Thanks. Something that developed as maybe one of the big impacts that Oxford had on me, was not just the library practice of being in the library, something that you just tend to do a lot in Oxford, something that was a big part of my life for a long time. But in Oxford, the library, the Bodleian Library, was right next door to this fantastic pub. So for better or worse, a lot of the process that I've described here continues to transpire in pubs. I don't know what the story might look like if it had been more aligned towards a path of sobriety. And, but I think, everybody's got a version of this. I tried to extol this process as one way, and there is a kind of a technique to it, but you have to kind of find your own way to it. You have to find, and I've seen some very elaborate, versions of a comparable process, like the writer Lawrence Wright, Boston-based journalist of Al-Qaeda, and most recently a book on Scientology. I mean, he has an incredibly impressive filing system and labels, and he tends to use dry boards rather than post-it notes. But you've got to find something to keep some order to it, especially in a book-length project. You can get literally lost in the weeds otherwise. And one of the little notes in terms of Farthest Home and the very differing editing process there, the narrative there is even more miasmic than in Places Left Unfinished. And so there, it wasn't until the book was in print that I realized there's a particular section that's reproduced that appears twice in the book. Because I'm moving things around constantly, and Jane undoubtedly would have caught that and made sure not to let it get into print. So it appeared in the hardback, but it's taken out for the paperback. Yes.
Question for you.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit or tell us about your relationship to Tejano and the term and that identity over the course of writing these two books? Like, do you feel like it shifted, solidified, like what?
Yeah, I mean, I think it came, for me, that story which I tried to describe, my sense of at the very beginning, very much the sense that this is, in a sense, a golden age of Tejana history. So many of the most important voices are still alive and working. Antonia Castañeda and Andrés Tijerina, Jerry Pollo, Frank de la Teja. Their work was coming out around the time Places Left Unfinished was, some of their writing was kind of concurrent. So explorations of Tejanidad particularly came into focus for me with the onset of the work on the second book. I began to see that really as my mother's family story. My father's family story, I didn't see as Tejano in a sense, because they had come out of Mexico during the time of the revolution. And I came to see the Tejano world uniquely is that world of families, of minds, of hearts that had been imprinted by this palimpsest of ages. The legacy of the conquest, the colonial era, the interaction with Anglo settlers, the negotiations and exploitations that took place in that period. My mother's family had that story. So in the second book, it's one of the reasons why with Places Left Unfinished, I wanted to call it an anti-memoir, because there were all these memoirs coming out, Angela's Ashes and Liars Club, and I didn't want to call it a memoir. And so, she didn't like Jane did not like anti-memoir. I said, what about a memoir without a subject? That was the period of the Seinfeld show, and like a show about nothing, a memoir without a subject. She didn't like that either. So I just did not fight about that. And we did a memoir. But with the second book, they gave me a little more license. I still didn't want to call it a memoir, so it's a Tejano elegy. So it's a narrative that is, by saying it's elegiac, means there is something implicitly poignant about it, perhaps, or a kind of farewell of sorts, and it is kind of where I am with this story, and I've been involved with some of these deliberations at the Whitty over the last couple of years, and the San Pedro Creek Linear Culture Park project, to think about how we embody these stories and exhibit them, and but for me, my orientation is somewhat radical or extreme in that by saying elegy, it imparts also that that these identity narratives are illusory, are always passing, they're transitional, they are transitory, they are makeshift and improvisational, and so some of that's embodied in there too. But one of the most remarkable developments with The Farthest Home, and for anybody that comes from San Antonio without roots in the valley, from Brother Javier's world, the valley is a very different kind of world. I sort of describe it as Texas' version of Yoknapatawpha County. It's the Faulkner world of Texas. It's very ingrown, inbred, and it has almost a secret society aspect to it, which I came to know during the period like between 2003 and 2010. That's really, for me, the epicenter of Tejano mind, Tejano culture, is the triangle between Brownsville, Laredo, and Corpus. That world is Tejano world. San Antonio is kind of linked to it through familial connections, but it has geographic specificity, and people from there, Javier, Hinojosa, to some extent Americo Paredes, to some extent Rivera, have a much deeper evocation of that. For me, I was an outsider there, and so the stories in The Farthest Home about Tejano encounters tend to be, alien, maybe preeminently the encounter I have, again, inadvertent. You couldn't script it or plan it. So, I'm coming across, I've been in Revilla, in the inundated town of Guerrero Viejo, where my grandmother's family had been among the founders. And I'm coming across this border checkpoint that is no longer open, the border checkpoint that used to be on the Falcon Dam. And it's a sleepy little border station. But the border agent, insists on searching my truck entirely. And then, as he's waving me goodbye, he sees this document on the front seat. It's a family history document of the Guerra family. He's Guerra, he's a Guerra name badge. And he says, "I'm in that book." I said, "Well, that's my family." He says, "Yeah." So we then end up talking for 20 minutes about, his, family history, and I showed him where my family had daughtered out, because we didn't appear in that book because the lineage was through my grandmother's line, and women tend to be written out of these august family histories, and it's actually called daughtering out. You daughter out of a family lineage. And in the meantime, he's waving cars through, and he said, as I was leaving, I said, "Well, how do you know I didn't set up to have this conversation with you so I could get all my narco friends to bring all the." I sent him the book. I never heard from him. But I think it's going to be very interesting to see how the Witty exhibit presents this. So Andres Tijerina, one of the historians of this generation dealing with Tejano history, has been put in charge of it. I think it's going to be up over the next 2 years, so it's not going to be immediately installed when it opens soon. But that protean world, when we look at the voting patterns, we see a very different kind of reality represented, and very different from recent immigrants, or for that matter, immigrants like my father's family that had 100 years here already. These people have a much older history, and when you meet a Tejano, like a real Tejano, they know porción numbers, and they know surnames, and so if you tell them you're a Lopez from Roma, from, let's see, Porción 69, like a particular land grant, that's a Tejano. But, the expansive, mythic reimagining of it that Ansaldúa started, I think imparted to all of us a kind of open charge to find a way through that history into kind of new expressions, new literary expressions, new creative visions. And something, is emerging down there still now that's this kind of vertebral city from, ultimately I think it will reach from Brownsville to Laredo. This kind of city along a highway that's just going to be endless, unlike anything I know of anywhere else in the Americas that kind of flanks the border. So it's a story, this is something I've been thinking about particularly in the last couple of months, thinking about the prospect of a border wall. Can the border wall contain this story? Can the border wall have any impact on this story? And I fundamentally think it cannot. That this story has such deep roots to it. The story that emerges into Tejanidad, that emerges out of Mexicanidad into Chicanidad and Latinidad in the US, is so deeply rooted and so slowly unfolding that everything that happens on that story turns out to be a kind of a plot twist rather than anything that kind of can really put a period or a punctuation mark on it. The prospects are that something, I see these lands as fundamentally as a place where things are being revealed, a place of imminence, where things are imminent, things are being revealed. There's a chapter that I mean it's a little conflicted, but in Robert Kaplan's Revenge of Geography, is the book from 2010. The last chapter in there is on Fernand Braudel and the longue durée, and he urges us to see the US-Mexico border through the lens of the French philosopher Fernand Braudel's idea of the long term. How do we look at the long-term story, the 500-year story, the millennial story? And what is it that these people are embodying and bringing forth out of our story traditions, out of our experiences, out of our struggles, to be seen?
On that note, would you mind if we, do you have a few more minutes to transition towards individuals coming to speak with you? I know a couple folks wanted maybe book signed, if you don't mind, or at least just meeting you and chatting with you. Okay, so let's, just before I close this section, let me just tell my students we're not ending. We're going to meet with John Phillip, chat with them, and then we'll take a